We've got a new subscriber. Thank you so much, Andy, for donating to us at the Red Eye Podcast. Your donation really helps us make this podcast, and you join the other Red Eye core crew. Ben, Laura, Asim, Kat, Ben, Dan, Stephen, Dina, Chris, Rebecca, Jez, Sally and Shelley. A pretty awesome crew, and we're very happy to have you with us. Now, on with the show. Now, I've spoken before about the many hats cabin crew wear. We're first aiders, safety personnel, firefighters, even amateur midwives if the occasion demands it. We're trained to use defibrillators, and did you know we can evacuate a full aircraft in just over 90 seconds? But not everything we deal with is covered in the manuals or the yearly refreshers. Sometimes something happens that nobody trained you for, and yet you still have to deal with it. Because when you're 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, there's no one else coming. It does make you wonder, though, is it the job that shapes us into the people who instinctively step forward, or were we always those people, and that's why we chose the job in the first place? Because the two incidents we've woven together for this week's episode both happened to me. One was in the air, and that one was mine to handle whether I felt ready or not. And then the other happened on the ground, in bright sunshine, on a day when I could have very easily just have kept on walking. No one would have known, and no one would have blamed me. But I stopped. And when I really think about it, I know most of my colleagues would have done the same. Not because it's written into our contracts or because we happen to be on a layover and very loosely on duty, but because people like us tend to gravitate towards jobs where we get to help others, even when it would be far easier to walk away. Doors to armed and cross-check. Come fly the Red Eye! Welcome aboard the Red Eye. London to Los Angeles, circa 2011. So far, everything was remarkably calm. Ali thought as she made her way from the very front of the aircraft all the way to the back without a single passenger stopping her for a drink. This route was notorious for its extravagant clientele. If anyone was going to mix vodka and Valium and provide an impromptu mid-Atlantic performance, it would usually be the flight to La La Land, home of the beautifully chaotic. At least that had been Ali's experience so far. But today, the cabin seemed to be full of the glowing green juice brigade, all toned limbs and reusable water bottles. No one was drinking to excess, and no one was behaving oddly. Yet. She reached the back galley and placed the cheese plate she'd liberated from the front onto the counter. Half of the crew had gone on rest, and the others were in the aisle offering juice and water, and so she soaked in the peace as she picked up a wedge of brie and dipped it generously in the chutney. She lifted it slowly, already tasting it before she'd even opened her mouth. Her lips parted, and just as she was about to stuff the whole thing in, the peace and quiet disappeared into thin air. Ali turned towards the sound, the wedge of brie still hovering in front of her mouth. Behind her, she saw a young girl standing at the entrance to the galley. She was small, with shoulder-length mousy hair. Her eyes were huge and dark, and from them, tears were pouring down her face. Reluctantly, Ali lowered the cheese and set it back on the plate, swallowing the saliva that had already gathered in anticipation of it. "Are you okay?" she asked. She wasn't entirely sure she wanted the answer. Not as sure as she'd been that she'd wanted that cheese, but there was something about the girl that pulled at her instinct to help. The girl shook her head and rubbed her cheek. "Can you see them?" She muttered something, but Ali couldn't quite catch it, so she stepped a little closer. "I'm sorry, can you say that again?" "Spiders," she said in a whisper. Ali's head snapped up as she looked down the dimly lit aisle, scanning the seats and the floor, wondering if they were on the girl's seat or crawling along the carpet. It wasn't unusual for the occasional stowaway bug to appear on board, but she wasn't sure she'd ever seen a spider before, or that she wanted to. And judging by this girl's reaction, it wasn't a small one. Her mind immediately began supplying her with images she would rather not have. Escaped tarantulas, Australian huntsmen, thick webs dangling from the overhead lockers, long, hairy legs brushing against her hair. Ali scratched her head subconsciously and then shuddered, quickly forcing herself to stop scratching her own cheek, mirroring the girl's actions. Where is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm.
"All over me. Can you see them?"
"Them," Ali repeated in her head, her skin prickling. "Them!" The girl's voice trembled and her body was shivering with small, involuntary jolts. Her wide eyes fixed on Ali, pleading silently for her help. Ali leaned in closer than she was entirely comfortable with and quickly scanned the exposed parts of her skin. A small mole just above the neckline of her sweater caught her off guard, and she nearly jumped back before realising what it was. But there was nothing there. Nothing moving. And certainly nothing with 8 legs. She breathed a sigh of relief and gave a small smile, laying her hand on the girl's shoulder and looked her straight in the eye. "There are no spiders," she said, softly but firmly. "Not a single one." But her calm assurance didn't work. The girl shook her head and began sobbing even harder. She dragged her fingers down both sides of her face, this time so forcefully that angry red marks appeared where her nails scraped across her skin.
"Yes, there are," she wailed. "They're all over me. I can feel them."
Ali reached out quickly and caught the girl's wrists, pulling her hands down before she could do any more damage. "My love, there are no spiders. I promise you," she said again. She could feel her own heart racing now, as well as her mind. But it wasn't because of imaginary spiders. It was because she was afraid of what this girl might do. "You have to stop scratching. You're hurting yourself," she said, her voice higher now, louder, trying to make herself heard through the other noise in the girl's head. She yanked one arm free from Ali's grip and immediately brought her hand back up again.
But I can feel them.
And she tore into her skin once again, the back of her neck, her chest, anywhere she could reach. At that moment, the 2 girls who had been in the aisle returned and stopped in their tracks at the entrance to the galley. They both stared at the scene in front of them, their mouths slightly open as they looked from Ali to the distressed passenger and then at each other. "Girls," Ali said breathlessly, "could you please reassure this poor girl that she has no spiders on her body?" The 2 exchanged a confused glance, and Ali tipped her head towards the girl, who had now released her hands and gone back to her furious scratching. "Just tell her there are no spiders on her skin," she said quietly, doing her best to keep her voice calm and neutral, and failing. "Oh!" One of them stepped closer, frowning slightly as she leaned in to take a careful look. She pursed her lips thoughtfully, making a small, considering sound, as though she were genuinely conducting a serious spider inspection. "No, hon," she said after a moment. "There aren't any spiders."
"But I can feel them,"
the girl cried again, her body writhing. The second girl stepped forward and gently placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "I promise you, there are no spiders anywhere," she said softly. "I'm a lifelong arachnophobe myself, love," she added with a small laugh. "If there were any spiders here, I'd already be halfway out the door." For a fleeting moment, it seemed her candid reassurance might have worked. The girl stopped scratching, just for a moment, and then she started again. This time, faster, harder, digging at her skin as if she were trying to claw her way beneath it, pulling at her hair and her clothes. Ali felt her feet take root in the floor, and for a moment she simply stood there, watching the girl claw at her own skin, knowing that nothing she said was getting through. Words were useless. Reason was useless. The girl's fear had made her blind and deaf to everything else she could offer. She reached out gently and placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her down onto the nearest jump seat. The girl collapsed onto the floor beside it, curling slightly inward as though trying to fold herself away from whatever it was she believed was crawling across her body. One of the other attendants hurried over and handed Ali a glass of water. Ali accepted it and held it out. "A little water," she said softly. A glass of water. The flight attendant's cure-all for everything from fainting to panic attacks. But would it help against imaginary spiders? Could a glass of water really compete with what was now clearly a full-blown psychotic episode? She took the water, took a sip, and then carried on scratching. Watching it made Ali's own skin prickle in sympathy. For a moment, she almost wanted to help her, add a few more fingernails to the desperate search for relief. "Shall we restrain her?" one of the girls whispered quietly from behind, careful to stay out of the passenger's earshot. Ali turned and looked at her, and she pictured it for a moment. Handcuffs clicking closed around those thin wrists, pinning her arms to stop her scratching the invisible things that were tormenting her. How would that possibly make it better for her? She shook her head. No, she wasn't dangerous. She was terrified. Completely and utterly terrified. She needed someone who was trained to deal with matters of the head, something that none of them were. "No," Ali said quietly. "Not unless she becomes a danger to someone else. I'm going to go and call Medlink." Medlink. Doctors on the ground who'd be able to guide her. Turning quickly, she headed up the aisle toward the flight deck. 10 minutes later, Ali sat with a headset pressed to one ear, listening carefully as a psychiatric doctor on the ground spoke. She'd never remember the exact words, or the medication they prescribed from the medical kit, but the combination of them kind of worked. Ali repeated the instructions, almost word for word, speaking gently to the girl as she sat beside her. And finally, something began to change. Her breathing slowed first, and then the scratching became less frantic. Eventually, her hands fell still, and for the first time since the episode began, she looked directly at Ali and seemed to truly hear what she was saying. And that was that. The spiders were gone. The poor young girl looked exhausted as she crumbled into the floor, breathing steady, but tired from the hours of scratching and mental torment. "Let's see if we can get you back to your seat," said Ali. Ali sat on her hands as the plane came into land at LAX. Another role to add to the list, she thought to herself with a tired flicker of humour. Cabin crew, first aider, and now apparently psychiatric nurse as well. The girl was asleep now. The cheese was in the bin, and Ali felt completely and utterly drained. "Are you coming for a drink tonight, Ali?" the girl in the opposite jump seat called across. Ali didn't even pause. "Yes," she said. She needed a large red wine, or 3, and a debrief. Something to take the edge off her thoughts so that she didn't end up lying awake tonight replaying it all, or worse still, dreaming about spiders. It had been really hard, dealing with something that wasn't physical, treating symptoms that couldn't be seen, for something that she had absolutely zero training in. And while she sat with a slight sense of satisfaction that she had indeed dealt with it, she offered up a silent prayer that she didn't ever need to do that again. But unfortunately for Ali, that prayer was not going to be answered. One month later. It was a glorious sunny morning as Ali walked down the hill in San Francisco. The name alone, Nob Hill, always made her smile like a 12-year-old schoolboy who'd just discovered a rude joke. But there was something about the place itself that lifted her spirits too. The grand white buildings stood proudly on either side of the street, their facades glowing in the early sunshine, while the trams rattled past on their tracks, climbing steadily up and down the steep hill. At the bottom, Union Square waited, tempting her with scores of shops which she fully intended to explore. It was still early, but her UK body clock had dragged her out of bed at 4 o'clock that morning, so she spent the last few hours restless in her hotel room, waiting for the city to wake up so she could head out for coffee and begin her day properly. And now, finally, the city was stirring. The sun was shining, and it promised to be a beautiful day. She had some money to spend, a whole day to herself, and... The strangled sound made her foot freeze halfway through a step. For a moment, she teetered awkwardly on the steep pavement, nearly pitching forward down the hill before catching her balance and planting her foot firmly on the ground. She lifted the other one, forcing herself to keep moving. San Francisco was beautiful, yes, but it also came with its fair share of characters and challenges. And that sound was not something she particularly wanted to investigate. It came again, louder this time, and broken by ragged sobs. Ali slowed, her instincts warring with each other as she weighed up her options. She could turn around, pretend she'd forgotten something, and head down a different street. No one would blame her for that. Or she could keep walking, eyes straight ahead, blinkers firmly in place. Just like walking down the aisle on a flight when you know perfectly well someone is about to stop you as you're heading for crew rest. Or she could glance left as she passed the gap between the two parked cars. Just a quick look, just enough to see what was going on. Damn it, she glanced left. You should have put your blinkers on, she scolded herself immediately. You should have just walked past. But no, you had to look. And now, look what you've got to deal with. Between the two parked cars crouched a naked young man. Well, almost naked. He would have been naked had he not been wearing a tiny leather thong and the, did horse reins count as clothes? Ali wondered, momentarily studying him with a morbid curiosity born from the sheer absurdity of what she was seeing. Yes, leather thong and horse reins. Oh, and a metal horse bit in his mouth. Her brain confirmed that what she was seeing was real after several blinks of disbelief and a quick elimination of any other possible explanations. And that should have been enough. Had that been all, a sobbing man in a leather thong and a horse rein around his head and a metal bit in his mouth, she might have offered a polite, "Take care, buddy," or perhaps a cautious, "Nice to meet you," before continuing down the hill. But that wasn't all, because she could now see what he was doing. The young man was sawing at his wrist with a jagged piece of broken glass. Her stomach dropped as she realised in that second that she wasn't going anywhere. That as much as she wished she had walked past, as much as she wished that she could simply offer a sympathetic nod and keep on moving, here was someone's child, trying, albeit very badly, to end his life. "Stop that," she said, the only words that she could think of. They came out sharper than she intended, but they got his attention. He froze mid-sob and looked up at her, saliva dribbling off the metal bit, his lips wrapped over it. She could see that the glass in his hand was so blunt that it had barely managed to break the skin, but with enough determination, or enough time, she was sure he would eventually manage what he was trying to do. "I said, stop that," Ali repeated, forcing firmness into her voice. He stared at her, still rubbing the shard backwards and forwards. Up close, she could see that his pupils were enormous, dark circles swallowing the colour of his eyes. His head lolled slowly from one side, his jaw biting firmly down on metal. He murmured dreamily, his gaze drifting over her in her white summer dress. Then he blinked slowly. "Are you Jesus?" Ali blinked at him. "Excuse me?" She pointed at her mouth. I'm so sorry. I can't understand you with that in. He pushed it out with his tongue and rested it on his chin, held in place by his reins. He wiped his lips with the back of his hand and he looked back at her. Are you Jesus? Ali looked down at her white dress and brown leather sandals and considered that question. Did she really look like Jesus in whatever altered reality he was currently inhabiting? And if she did, could that be a superpower right now? Jesus, he repeated, raising the glass slowly back towards his wrist. Yes, Ali said, thinking quickly. Yes, I am Jesus. She straightened slightly, adopting what she hoped was a suitably divine level of authority, and gave her first order. Yes, I am Jesus. Now stop that. And he did. He gave an almost imperceptible nod and laid the glass on the floor. He'd listened to Jesus. And Ali let out a long breath of relief she hadn't realised she'd been holding in as she scooched the glass away with her sandal. Now just wait there, she ordered, pointing at him with her red-nailed divine finger while she dialed 911 on her phone. The distant wail of sirens was the most beautiful sound she'd heard all morning. Ali wasn't entirely sure how much longer she could keep up the Jesus act. She stepped out from between the cars and waved urgently as the ambulance and police turned onto the street and began climbing the hill towards them. The vehicle pulled up beside her and one of the paramedics jumped out of the passenger seat. Ali felt the weight lift from her shoulders. This poor boy, who had clearly had far too much fun the night before and now needed a little help navigating the aftermath, was finally going to be in the right hands. Soon enough, they would get him cleaned up, settled down, and no doubt his parents would be called to collect him. She pictured them arriving, tired but relieved, shaking their heads and telling him gently but firmly not to do anything like that again. Ali opened her mouth, ready to explain everything she had just seen, but the paramedic cut her off before she could even begin. He walked straight past her and crouched beside the young man. "Morning, Gary," he said casually, slipping an arm under his shoulder and hauling him gently to his feet. "Good night, was it?" The familiarity of it made Ali snap her mouth shut. Gary swayed slightly as he stood. Ali blinked. "So, you know him?" she asked. Yeah," the paramedic gave her a grin. "Gary's a bit of a regular around here," he said, leading him away. Ali frowned. The wholesome and seemingly naive picture she'd painted in her head of a young man who had simply gone a little bit too far on a wild night out began to crumble rather quickly. "Right," she said, trying to squash the indignation she felt rising. "I'll leave you to it then." She bent down and retrieved her now cold coffee from where she'd set it on the pavement earlier, brushing a little dust from the lid before stepping back onto the sidewalk. As she began walking away, trying to get her thoughts together, she glanced back over her shoulder. Gary was being guided carefully towards the ambulance, his butt cheeks wobbling either side of his thong, reins swinging freely down his back. She wondered what might have actually happened if she hadn't stopped, whether he really might have hurt himself eventually, or whether this was simply another strange chapter in his story. "Nice to meet you, Gary," she said quietly. He must have heard her because he looked back over his shoulder and gave her a lopsided smile. "You too, Jesus," he said back, giving her a small wave. Ali shook her head and paused for a moment before continuing down the hill toward Union Square. The sun was warm on her face, and the city was now fully awake around her. As she walked, she tried to work out whether what she was feeling was amusement, trauma, or if she was simply annoyed that her morning had been hijacked by someone who had made some bad decisions. Perhaps it was a mixture of all three, she decided as the door to Macy's opened in front of her with a soft swoosh. And then, as she stepped inside, she felt a big smile spread across her face. The sun was shining. Gary was safe. She'd had a taste of divine power that most people would never get in a lifetime, and there was a full day of shopping ahead. And it was only 10 a.m. She dropped her cup of cold coffee into the bin just inside and headed towards the escalators to where the shoe section was. She definitely needed some new sandals. The Red Eye podcast is written by Kaylee Kay, narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Red Eye podcast. You guys are why we do this. We love the stories that you have, and we love telling you the stories that people share with us. To help us reach more people and get the podcast really out there, we would really appreciate it if you left a review. It just helps our podcast be a little bit more visible. Thank you.